On a September Sunday in 1408, a wedding took place at the stone church of Valsey in Greenland. It was a joyful, ordinary ceremony by all accounts. No hint of hardship or looming disaster was mentioned in the letters that recorded the event. Yet that wedding would go down in history as the last anyone heard from Greenland's Norse colony. After nearly 400 years on the island's remote shores, the Norse settlers seemingly vanished from the historical record without explanation. When European missionaries returned to Greenland in the 18th century, they found only ruins, great stone halls, abandoned farms, and crumbling churches, but no people. The fate of these settlers at the edge of the medieval world remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The Norse presence in Greenland began around 985 AD, when Eric the Red, an exiled Icelander notorious for his fiery temper, set sail westward and stumbled upon a frigid new land. In an effort to attract colonists to this new landscape, he massaged the truth and dubbed it Greenland, hinting at fertile meadows he found in the southern fjords. In reality, despite the misleadingly pleasant name, most of Greenland is blanketed by an ice sheet and was uninhabitable. The Norse established two settlements along Greenland's southwest, a larger eastern settlement near the island's southern tip, and a smaller western settlement roughly 240 miles to the north. At their peak, perhaps 2,500 Norse lived in Greenland, clustered on hundreds of farmsteads around a dozen small churches. These settlers brought along sheep, goats, and cattle, and tried to recreate European farming life on Greenland. They hunted seals and caribou, and their ships carried Arctic goods to trade in Europe. Walrus tusks in particular were a lifeline, and this prized ivory was exchanged for iron, timber, and other supplies the Greenlanders lacked. For several centuries, the Greenlanders managed to sustain their fragile colony. They built churches and farmsteads, and even imported luxuries like stained glass for chapel windows. For a time they survived through ingenuity and determination. The Greenland outpost even served as a base for further exploration, and Eric the Red's son, the famous explorer Leif Erikson, sailed from Greenland to North America around 1000. But by the 1300s, the colony showed ominous signs of decline. The western settlement was the first to falter, likely being abandoned around 1350. The eastern settlement lasted a bit longer. The final written report from Greenland was that Valsey church wedding of 1408, and after that, nothing more remained. By around 1450, archaeological evidence indicates the eastern settlement too was deserted. Given that Greenland was totally out of the way, this disappearance went unnoticed for literal centuries. When a group of Danish missionaries arrived in 1721, they found only ruins and animal bones, but no surviving Norse people. Lacking written accounts of disaster, researchers have turned to physical clues. Trash heaps at Norse sites reveal a gradual shift. Later layers hold many seal bones and few cow or sheep bones, signaling a diet increasingly reliant on marine food. Chemical analysis of Norse skeletons confirms that by the 14th century, up to 80% of their diet came from the sea, mostly seal, a huge jump from earlier times. This suggests they were adapting to failing crops and shrinking herds. Even so, their society was in decline. Eventually, even the farms and churches were abandoned. We don't know if the last Greenlanders died out or chose to leave voluntarily, only that by 1500 at the latest, they were gone. A leading explanation for the colony's disappearance is natural climate change, specifically the onset of the Little Ice Age. The Norse initially benefited from the medieval warm period running from about 900 to 1300, which provided milder weather for grazing and plentiful seas. After about 1250, however, the climate began to slowly turn. Winters grew longer and colder, and summers grew shorter and less intense. While this effect was felt in other parts of the world, it's thought to have had a particularly outsized impact on the Norse in Greenland, who were trying to replicate a European lifestyle. As temperatures dropped, less hay could be grown and sea ice clogged the coasts. Repeated harsh winters would have caused fodder shortages, starving the Norse's livestock and setting the stage for famine. Climate challenges went beyond the cold as well. Sediment studies suggest a prolonged drought struck southern Greenland in the 1300s and 1400s, making it hard to grow enough hay for winter. They were also struck by rising sea levels, and archaeological evidence shows that Norse settlements moved further away from the coast as time went on. In short, the Norse faced a perfect storm of environmental stress: colder climate, drought, and encroaching seas, all of which undermined their survival. This mix of factors is compelling, though climate alone may not explain everything. After all, the Inuit, who were also present on the island, survived these changes. However, they lived a very different lifestyle. Another factor was the collapse of trade and the colony's isolation from Europe. Greenland depended on Norway for supplies like iron and lumber, paid for with local products such as walrus ivory. For centuries, walrus tusks were a major export. But as time went on, the European market for walrus ivory crashed when higher quality African elephant ivory became available. Suddenly, the Greenlanders had little value to trade for essentials. In the mid-14th century, Europe was plagued by the Black Death, which compounded these woes by devastating Norway and other trading partners. Norway's capacity to send ships to Greenland essentially collapsed. It's unknown if the plague reached Greenland, but the effect was that the colony became cut off. Fewer supply ships meant no new goods or new settlers, leaving the Greenland Norse to fend for themselves. This extreme isolation meant that when the climate turned against them and the flow of resources dried up, they had no lifeline. The trade collapse and isolation weren't likely the sole cause of the colony's end, but they greatly weakened its resilience and contributed to the crisis. Another possible piece of the puzzle is the Norse interaction with the indigenous Inuit people who arrived in Greenland during the 1200s. Norse accounts mention a few skirmishes with the Inuit, whom they called Skraelings, and Norse artifacts have turned up at Inuit sites, indicating some contact. It has been suggested that competition or conflict with the Inuit may have hastened the Norse decline. That said, there is little hard evidence of sustained violence. Beyond those couple of skirmishes, neither archaeology nor Inuit oral history shows signs of a civilization clash between the two groups. Historians believe it's likely the Norse and Inuit mostly kept to separate regions of Greenland. They likely traded at times, and presumably maintained a mutual level of distrust. So while occasional clashes or competition might have added to the Norse settlers' troubles, conflict with the Inuit alone doesn't seem to explain their disappearance. At most, it was another challenge that made survival more difficult. The final mystery is just what happened to these Norse people in their final days. There are hints that a group of survivors might have tried to sail away, perhaps back to Iceland or Norway, or even westward to North America. If any did, no record of their successful arrival exists. Such refugees may have perished at sea or simply left no trace. Some historians have even suggested that a few Norse may have assimilated into the Inuit population, though the genetic data is currently lacking. For now, the disappearance of the Norse in Greenland remains an enduring historical mystery. The consensus for the time being is that it was likely a combination of many factors that overwhelmed their colonies on the edge of the European world. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out my other channels, my podcast, and more by clicking the links in the description. There's a significant amount of misunderstanding about the diet of medieval people, with peasants often being depicted as constantly on the verge of starvation. In this segment, we're going to separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to the medieval peasant diet in England. Medieval English peasants didn't survive on gruel alone. In fact, their daily fare was more varied and substantial than popular myths suggest. For the vast majority of English peasants, bread was the cornerstone of the diet. Historical records indicate a typical peasant consumed around 2 to 3 pounds of bread per day, similar in quantity to what the nobility ate. This bread was usually coarse and dark, and made from cheaper grains like rye, barley, or oats, rather than fine white wheat. In fact, the color and texture of bread served as a class marker. The darker and heavier the loaf, the lower the status of its eater. Peasants often had to bake with what was available, mixing rye or barley with legumes to stretch flour supplies. Wheat bread, the light, refined kind, was a rarity for them, since wheat was a cash crop usually reserved for paying rents or supplying the lord's household. To accompany all that bread, the typical peasant meal featured pottage, a thick soup or stew. Pottage wasn't a single recipe, but rather a catch-all term for a one-pot meal of boiling grains, vegetables, and whatever else was on hand. A basic pottage might include chopped onions, root vegetables like turnips or carrots, leafy greens and beans, all simmered together. If available, a bit of meat or fish could be added to enrich the flavor. Bits of pork were especially common, as many peasants kept a pig or two and used every part of the animal. Salted bacon could flavor a pot of vegetables, and even blood was used in dishes like black pudding. Dairy products also featured in peasant diets and used milk or whey in cooking when they could. Eggs from chickens kept in the yard provided additional protein and were a regular part of meals throughout the year. Ale was the standard drink for medieval peasants in England, as clean water wasn't always available. Even when clean water was available, peasants often preferred fermented drinks, since they were perceived as being much safer than water, and they weren't exactly wrong. Peasants brewed ale from barley and other grains, producing a mildly alcoholic porridge-like beverage that was nutritious and safer than many water sources. This was essentially a liquid bread rather than a modern drink, and the calories from ale helped peasants work. It was common for people of all ages to drink weak ale daily, and quantities consumed could be impressive by modern standards. Contemporary accounts across Europe suggest peasants might drink anywhere from 2 to 4 liters of beer a day. That said, it's important to remember that these drinks were extremely weak in terms of alcoholic content. Unlike in other parts of Europe, medieval English peasants rarely, if ever, drank wine, unless they were particularly wealthy members of the class, or for one exception I'll discuss in a bit. Also, to tip my hand a bit, that exception wasn't typically communion wine, which due to scarcity wasn't widely used in England during the time period. Forage foods also played a big part of their diet throughout the warmer seasons. Gathering seasonal wild berries, nuts, and fruit helped supplement the diet of your average medieval English peasant. Winter meals were necessarily the most monotonous. The need to bridge this seasonal gap drove peasants to become skilled in preservation techniques and communal storage, which shaped their eating habits significantly. Fresh produce was scarce, with cabbages and root vegetables being the main fresh plants that could endure winter storage. Thus, winter pottage might lean heavily on dried beans and peas, root crops, and preserved ingredients. Salted pork or smoked bacon might be added sparingly to stews for fat and flavor. Likewise, salted or dried fish was common in winter, especially as meat was off limits on many religious fast days. On the whole, specifics could be enriched or narrowed by where they lived and how much they earned. A sheep farming village would necessarily consume more mutton and dairy. A woodland village, on the other hand, could add significantly more forage, nuts, berries, and the occasional poached game animal. Since the medieval period is long, it's important to remember that economic conditions for English peasants weren't the same throughout. In what might seem to be a counterintuitive twist at first glance, English peasants are thought to have eaten best in the wake of the Black Plague. During this period, labor was scarce and wages rose, so surviving peasants could afford better food, including much more meat. There's a popular image of medieval English peasants living on the brink of starvation. While medieval life certainly had its hardships, the idea that peasants ate only bland, inferior food in a desperate attempt to survive the day is a stereotype not supported by the evidence. In reality, during normal years, peasants generally had enough calories from their grain-heavy diet. Starvation occurred in times of famine, which were terrible when they hit, but weren't perpetual by any means. In good times, medieval English peasants ate until they were full, even if the diet was simple, and as I'll get to shortly, peasants occasionally got to really pig out as well. Another idea is that peasants essentially never ate meat, and that meat was reserved for the nobility. While it's true meat was rarer and considered a luxury, peasants did eat meat occasionally. They raised pigs and chickens that could be slaughtered, and sometimes had mutton from aging sheep. It's important to remember that feudal lords and peasants often maintained quite cordial and positive relationships. Lords would occasionally give peasants a share of hunted deer to show their generosity to their subjects. When lords weren't willingly sharing their wild animals, poachers stepped up their game, especially in densely forested areas. Peasants also ate fish quite often, especially on church-mandated meatless days. Common fish weren't an elite food, and cheaper fish like herring or locally caught eels were common peasant fare, depending on how close they lived to a body of water. However, when it comes to consumption of meat by English peasants, there are areas of uncertainty. We know meat was occasional, but quantifying just how rare it was is hard, and this of course depends on the time period. Some evidence suggests that before the Black Death, lower class diets were very heavy in bread and porridge with quite minimal animal protein. After the peasant population thinned, meat and cheese became more common for ordinary people as peasants became wealthier. It's also important to remember that the church calendar also provided numerous feast days, which, though spiritually focused, often became occasions for eating better than usual. Saints' days, Christmas, Easter, and weddings or village festivals were times when peasants might get a break and a very hearty meal, sometimes full of rare delights depending on the host. English lords were generally expected to host large feasts for their tenants. This was a chance both to show their generosity and grandeur, and also continue to win the favor of the people they ruled. Notably, these sorts of events may have been the only opportunity for an average peasant to taste a cup of wine or a truly delicious roast. By examining what medieval English peasants ate and drank, we can gain insight into the people who formed the majority of the population. From this, we can learn that while peasants definitely didn't have it easy, they didn't spend their miserable lives starving between servings of gruel. Modern pop culture has firmly embedded the idea of the Thieves' Guild in the public imagination. Fantasy novels and video games frequently portray a formal guild of thieves, a structured, almost professional association of criminals akin to the craft guilds of old. Such portrayals have led many fans to wonder if these criminal guilds existed in history, assuming that the prevalence of the trope hints at a historical reality. Long before modern video games glamorized thieves' guilds, Writers of the early modern period were already playing with the idea as a tongue-in-cheek fiction. A standout example comes from 1613, when Miguel de Cervantes, better known as the author of Don Quixote, published a short story called Rinconete y Cortadillo. In this comedic tale, set in Cervantes' own time, two young petty thieves arrive in Seville only to stumble into the city's well-organized guild of thieves. These two ragamuffins think they can just start stealing and profiting. But nope, they're wrong. There's a bureaucracy they've got to deal with. Cervantes presents Seville's underworld as if it were governed by a formal thieves' guild modeled on a craft guild. The head of this criminal organization is the colorful chief thief, Monipodio, who presides over a den of rogues as their guild master. Cervantes' protagonists quickly learn that they can't pick pockets in Seville without registering with Monipodio's guild. To a reader at the time, this would have reflected the guilds that dominated Spanish cities, ensuring every profession was regulated. Inside Cervantes' fictional guild, the parody continues. Monipodio's band of cut-purses and swindlers use guild terminology: apprentices, masters, secret passwords, and a ledger of misdeeds. Thieves attend their own special church to pray for success in their illicit endeavors. The narrative highlights how every thief must learn the ropes as an apprentice and eventually become a master thief, just as if he were rising through the ranks of a lawful craft. For Cervantes' audience, the notion of thieves enforcing guild rules would have been delightfully absurd. It was a clever satire of the overly regulated guild culture of Spain, which he implicitly viewed as restraining economic growth. By depicting the underworld as meticulously organized as the official economy, Cervantes was not suggesting such a guild actually existed. Rather, he was using irony to comment on society. In fact, the story likely resonated because everyone knew thieves didn't have an actual guild. Thus, the absurdity derived from treating crime as a legitimate unionized profession, like tailors or blacksmiths, with all the civic privileges a guild had in a town or city. Interestingly, while this work was understood by everyone as a clever satire, some have argued there may be some historical precedent for real thieves' guilds. For instance, the Egyptian city of Cairo, while under Ottoman rule, had an organization that is often likened to a real-life thieves' guild. However, unlike a real guild, which is designed to regulate a craft, this organization was something slightly different. All evidence indicates that it was actually an organization where thieves could fence their items. This was thus more like a well-entrenched organized crime syndicate than an actual guild, since unlike an actual guild, there was no civic privileges to go along with it. The Cairo authorities weren't being petitioned by the Thieves Guild to shut down unlicensed pickpockets or fences. Even if the organization was able to hold significant sway over city officials and exercise power from the shadows, this simply makes it a criminal syndicate, not a guild. In fact, most instances of so-called historical thieves' guilds are just simply organized crime groups operating in a region. The idea of a thieves' guild, popularized by fantasy fiction and video games, doesn't hold up historically because it misunderstands what a guild actually was. Real medieval guilds were legal regulated associations of craftsmen or merchants formed to protect economic interests, set standards, and support members. They were recognized by local authorities and often integrated into civic structures. Thieves, by contrast, operated outside the law and couldn't organize openly without attracting immediate suppression. Criminal networks certainly existed, but they were secretive, fragmented, and often lacked the hierarchical structure or mutual protection typical of legitimate guilds. This is one of the reasons why Cervantes' satire was so hilarious to readers at the time. Thieves, by definition, couldn't be a guild, because the organization into a guild requires officially backed legitimacy. In short, a thieves' guild is a fiction that misrepresents both criminal reality and medieval institutions. While they may be fiction, given how ubiquitous they've become, it's quite clear that the trope resonates heavily with readers and gamers. In the late 15th century, a quiet convent in Germany became the unlikely epicenter of a bizarre outbreak. It began with a single nun who, without apparent reason, felt an irresistible urge to bite her fellow sisters. This nun lunged and bit one companion after another, and before long the strange impulse had spread. Soon every nun in that convent was caught up in a frenzy of biting. The contagion didn't stop at the convent's walls. As word of the biting nuns spread through the region, other nuns in other convents began exhibiting the same startling behavior, almost as if the very idea were infectious. According to later accounts, news of the initial incident passed throughout Germany, before working its way into other regions. From there, the biting mania then jumped to neighboring countries, even reaching as far away as Rome. In the superstitious climate of the late Middle Ages, the immediate assumption was often supernatural. Many concluded that the nuns must have been possessed by demons or some sort of spiritual affliction. Priests reasoned that if the cause was not an obvious physical illness, it had to be the work of the devil and his minions. The convents convened special prayers and masses, imploring divine help for the afflicted sisters. When prayer alone failed to calm the biting frenzy, the church escalated to exorcisms. These formal rituals were intended to cast out evil spirits that they believed were prompting the nuns to behave like wild animals. These religious remedies, however, had no effect on the outbreak. According to much later tellings, the attempts to exorcise the so-called demons only made matters worse by intensifying the nuns' own fear. Hearing that the devil might be loose among them sent the most impressionable sisters into panic, so that they too felt the urge to bite. In essence, the very belief that they were bewitched helped the contagion spread even faster. With exorcisms failing and the biting epidemic only growing, the secular authorities decided to intervene with more direct measures. Local officials and physicians were called in to stop the madness before it spread further. They abandoned any supernatural explanation and addressed the situation in the most literal way possible. The nuns were firmly told that there was nothing demonic happening, and that the compulsion to bite was not a curse, but a figment of their own imagination. What could have caused such an outbreak in the first place? With the benefit of hindsight, modern scholars classify the biting nuns episode as a classic case of mass hysteria, or what today might be termed mass psychogenic illness. In essence, this means there was no physical pathogen. It was a psychological phenomenon in which mental stress and suggestion led to real physical actions. Mass hysterias tend to occur in places where tightly bound groups of people live under pressure, and medieval convents fit the bill exactly. At that time, many young women were forced by their families to enter convent life. Once inside, they had to endure an austere existence that demanded constant obedience, poverty, and long hours of labor and study. These nuns lived cloistered from the world, in what were essentially communal, high-stress conditions, not of their own choosing. It's not hard to imagine the psychological strain this could create on these women. Frustrations and fears would build up in such an environment, even if unspoken. We know today that such pent-up stress can sometimes find unusual outlets. In the terminology of modern psychology, the nuns may have been experiencing a conversion disorder. This is when an emotional or psychological conflict is unconsciously converted into unusual physical behavior, in this case, compulsive biting. But here, there's also the element of mass psychogenic illness, indicating that this spread throughout these very tight-knit and isolated communities. Notably, in an interesting twist, there is a further mystery associated with the biting nuns that isn't often discussed. It's very possible the story of the biting nuns was exaggerated or even invented. There's no solid contemporary evidence, no surviving convent records, and most accounts come from much later writers who summarize sources that are now lost to us. That said, the main source which is cited for the biting nuns case is Justus Hecker, a highly respected 19th century German physician. Given his stellar reputation, historians of medicine generally believe that he was legitimately working with sources that are now simply lost in the two intervening centuries.